Hello, everyone, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. I'm the Director of Communications at PFLAG National. My pronouns are she, her, and it is great to welcome you to our weekly inclusion conversation. And as always, I am going to bring in my co-conspirator and collaborator and our lead in all things diversity and inclusion here at PFLAG National, my friend Jean Marie Nevada. Hello, Jean Marie.
Hello, Liz. That is an awesome responsibility that just got put upon me, even though it is technically my job.
Well, I'm going to place the crown on your head and step back as I bow. I will leave.
I humbly accept the crown. Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. And every single Thursday, we get together to have a conversation. We love talking about different and emerging subjects. And this week is no different. So we decided that with Valentine's Day coming up, everybody seemed to have their focus on conversations about relationships and sex and romance and love. And we thought, what if we actually change up the discussion this year? And the topic that I've been reading a lot about and trying to understand more about is actually asexuality. And recently I came across a book that really got my attention and made me want to understand this more. And we are very lucky to actually have the author of that book here today. So with that, let me please introduce Angela Chen, who is joining us for the conversation. Hey, Angela.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, we are so excited to have you. So Angela just published ACE, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex. It is fascinating. If you have not read it yet, I really encourage you to check it out. So Angela, before we get into any of the questions, because we have our questions set up for everybody, and just as a reminder, if you're looking for the article and the questions, you can go to straightforequality.org/discussion series to get those. But could you tell us just quickly a little bit about what brought you to this book, what your experiences were, and how you got here?
Absolutely. So to be honest, kind of a long story. I'll tell the very quick version. I actually learned about asexuality when I was 14. I read the definition online and I was like, cool. And I never thought about it again. It wasn't a moment when I thought, oh, that's me, I'm ace. And then 10 years later, after I'd been in 2 serious relationships that weren't celibate, I started wondering is there something different about the way I experienced the world? And it wasn't because, there were any of what we might call sexual problems, but there were, many things throughout my life that had me thinking I might be different. And then I came to asexuality again. And this time I realized, oh, I am ace. It's just that 10 years ago, I misunderstood asexuality. I thought that if you were ace, it meant that you were repulsed by sex, or that you didn't want to have sex, or maybe that you're not interested in romance. And those were things I was all curious about and interested in about. And it made me realize there's so much that the ace lens can teach, and it can be so enriching. And, the book came out of that.
And your narrative, if you haven't checked out the article that we actually used this week for today's, for the discussion, you definitely should check it out, because I think it helped me wrap my head around things a little bit differently. So for people who are newer to this conversation, can you help them understand when we talk about asexuality and people who are ace, what is that? Who are we talking about? What is that experience? And how do that and aromantic differ? Because I think sometimes those two terms tend to get conflated, and I think that makes people a little confused.
Absolutely. So the official definition of asexual is it means you don't experience sexual attraction. But the confusing thing is it's possible to not experience sexual attraction and still have sex, or still even be interested in sex, because you can have sex for emotional reasons, or because you're bored, or for any number of reasons. And I think that's why a lot of people who maybe would identify as ace just don't really understand the word and think that, oh, that's not me. That was the case for me. And I think sexual orientation and romance are so often conflated. We think that they always have to come together, they're the same thing. But what aces do is we actually separate the two. So our sexual orientation is, asexual, but we also have a romantic orientation. So you can be heteroromantic, or you can be, panromantic. And aromantic are people who don't experience romantic attraction. And some people are ace and not aromantic. Some people are aromantic and not asexual. So there's a lot of possibilities here.
Do you think there are any more terms that sort of come into this conversation that are sort of emerging that people should be aware of, or are sort of those the two key terms that seem to be in the center of it?
There are definitely more terms. I think, without getting too much into the weeds, the important thing to think about is that it's a spectrum. Just like there's more than just gay or straight, one important term is gray A. So that means you're, somewhere on the A spectrum. The word allosexual basically means anyone who's not asexual. And, when it comes to romance and romantic attraction, that's a spectrum too. Some people feel a lot of romantic attraction, some people don't, and there's stuff in the middle. So I think as you explore these words in this world, it's not just these are three things, I'm one or the other. There's a lot of shades of gray.
Yeah, and I think that tends to be where people get a little bit confused. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier before this started was that people look for so many definites. We want people to be in a permanent place throughout their lives, and that actually is not the way most people actually are. So I want to talk a little bit about both your personal experience and your professional experience, because you've now approached this as someone who identifies as, and then you've also written about it in a larger scale. So what are some of the ways that people who are ace that they get erased from our conversations and erased from just being seen? How does this show up in everyday society that just sort of makes people sometimes feel that there really isn't a place for them?
Yeah, I think that to a certain extent, there is this belief that asexuality does not exist and it's just the side effect of something else. So obviously I believe asexuality exists, and I think that just sexual variation exists. Some people experience a lot of attraction, some people don't. But so often what ace is here is, oh, you're not ace, you're just repressed. You need to, sexually liberate yourself. Oh, you're not ace, you just have some kind of mental issue. Maybe you're physically sick. Maybe there's something wrong with you. There's all of these stereotypes, like a lack of, sexual attraction is really conflated with being broken or prude, or a lot of people often think that if you're ace, it means you are anti-sex and you're really conservative. And that's just not the case for most aces that I know. And so I think it's really hard to claim asexuality because in the back of your mind, you're always wondering, what if they're right? What if this is not just how I am, just a form of human variation? What if this is actually, something I need to fix? So one huge thing is that idea that, you always need to be fixed. And also I think it's just rough when people aren't talking about it as a way to be. In my book, I talk about this one woman who in high school, she really thought she was dying, and she got blood tests because in sex ed class, they were saying, oh, everyone's going to experience sexual attraction. This is just what happens to all normal people. And, if you go on WebMD, lack of sexual attraction is a side effect for all of these various diseases. Right. And so she really was like, oh my God, I'm different. And instead of being like, I'm different, I relate to the world differently, she was like, I'm dying, I'm sick. Yeah. And there's so many stories of aces who are prescribed medication or told they need to maybe uncover some trauma that's not even there. There's just really the sense that being ace means that either there's something wrong with you or you're just kind of a boring person. The same person I was just talking about, who in high school had the blood test, she wants to be a writer. She is a writer. And she actually came out to her writing tutor because she wanted to write ace characters. And her writing tutor was like, oh, that's not real. How can you be a writer if you don't have sex? How can you be passionate if you don't have sex? And there's all of these really regressive ideas. And that's a really extreme example, but I think some of these ideas are still floating in the air.
It seems like it's not as many examples of sort of overt discrimination, but the lack of inclusion, the lack of understanding, the total rejection of the identity is how this seems to be showing up to me. Does that sound kind of accurate, that people just are not even acknowledging that people are there?
Yeah, and not acknowledging it, or when aces try to talk about ace identity, people are like, why would you talk about it? You're just not doing something. But the reason to talk about it is because you're expected to do something, And so when people make fun of you for not doing something, or they say you're sick, that creates pressure. You don't have the freedom to be how you want to be.
This conversation, I've definitely seen this conversation starting up a lot more in LGBTQ plus spaces, because we do spend a lot of time looking at sexual liberation and what that means and all of the ways that it plays out. So, we've definitely seen a lot of the conversations about people who are ace happening sort of in LGBTQ quarters. But what has your experience been with that? Do you find on the balance that this is more understood in queer spaces? Is it less understood? Or is it just a completely new conversation that sort of because of where people are coming from, we might have to continue working at?
I think on the whole, it's more understood in LGBT spaces. And, since the book has come out, LGBT groups like PFLAG have, reached out to me, and that's so heartening. At the same time, I think there can be misunderstandings and tension, because I think that, as we were talking about before this began, there's a focus on sexual liberation. And of course, the queer community has been shamed in ways that are horrible. So when you hear about people talking about, asexuality, there can be this response like, we worked so hard to be able to have these sexual rights. Are they anti-sex? Are they Puritan? And that's not what aces are. We're just trying to expand sexual liberation. So it's not just one kind of sexuality is correct. So I think sometimes there can be this tension. Sometimes I think for aces, feeling included in the LGBT community, that can feel conditional. Sometimes, there's a lot of discussions about it. But on the whole, I think because queer folks are just more likely to know about asexuality and more educated about what it is, I think on the whole, queer spaces are more accepting.
That really is good to hear, because I think it could be a difficult conversation for all the reasons that you identified. And yet I think there's so much potential, because in some ways, people in queer spaces probably should understand what this feels like, or at least that experience of being treated differently, discriminated against, or even erased simply because you are not, sort of what the predominant strain of people tends to be.
Yeah. Not only that, but something I always say is that what aces talk about, this idea of compulsory sexuality, various types of sexual pressure, they're not experienced only by aces. You can be straight and experience, these questions of like, should I be having more sex? Am I sick if I don't want it? A lot of people who are ace are also, gay or trans or queer in another way, and they experience that too. So it's not like aces are the only people who are vulnerable to these pressures. We just probably experience them most acutely.
Yeah. So I did a lot of homework preparing for this and trying to look for examples of where I see people who are ace or characters who are ace showing up sort of in mass media and mainstream media. And the one that keeps coming up is BoJack Horseman. But there's not a whole lot out there that I was able to find. Have you seen any examples of how this is starting to show up sort of in pop culture? Is anybody getting it right? Are people maybe not getting it right and we should be addressing that? What are you seeing? Or is this showing up more?
I think in terms of mass culture, like we're talking prime time television, it's still not that common. I mean, BoJack is off the air now, and I think there was a report from GLAAD saying that with BoJack ending, and there's another show, Shadowhunters, that had an ace character. With that ending, there are no ace characters on primetime American television. And I think when it comes to books and literary culture, there's lots of great ace representation, but I think a lot of it is not in mainstream trade literary fiction. And I think that is a challenge too, even though, of course, the ace rep that exists is great. And I think another thing that's difficult is that a lot of the ace stories, I think, are very similar. They tend to be about someone who's realizing what asexuality is and questioning that arc. And that's what it was like in BoJack. And that's important. But I personally would want to see us move beyond that, because there's more to being ace than coming out and learning about the orientation. It's a whole way of looking at the world. And I think it changes how you think about relationships. There's obviously older aces too. And I think it changes how I think about children and marriage. And so there's so much richness. There's not just one story. And I think we're still getting to beyond the, coming out ace story.
I feel like the conversation that we're having is the conversation we would have had about even just gay visibility 25 years ago. Like, it needs to be beyond the coming out story and the HIV/AIDS story. It needs to actually acknowledge that we exist in all aspects of the world, and our stories go beyond that, and they are affected by identity in different kinds of ways. So it's kind of interesting to see this evolution that needs to happen in this space. Mm-hmm. So, one of the things that we really like to do at PFLAG, because we are very much doer-focused people, is we like to talk about what we should start doing and what we should stop doing, because the whole goal of everything that we are doing is to make more inclusive spaces for people and make people feel more welcome. So can you talk to us a little bit about some of those behaviors that people may be doing that they're, don't even notice that might be exclusionary? And what are some ways that people might be able to practice a little bit more inclusion and awareness for people who are ace? And I'd like to point out, even if you don't necessarily know anybody is, I think we always talk about inclusion is doing the right thing even when somebody's not in the room. So what are some stop doing this and what are some start doing this is that maybe people can look at?
Yeah, I think one really important thing, and this is pretty obvious, is just the importance of really educating yourself so the aces or maybe they're not out as ace, don't have to educate you. And I think that's doubly true for queer spaces because that is one of the spaces in which aces tend to gravitate to. So imagine going to a space that's supposed to be in some way, at least for you, and still having to explain like, oh, that's not what it is. And, it's tiring already to give that talk. So anytime you can save someone from doing that, informational TED talk, the better. I think also just keeping an eye out for, again, this word compulsory sexuality and all the ways in which we link, not just sexuality to like vitality, but the lack of sexuality to something being wrong with you. And I think being really careful with language is important. This content is everywhere. Just today, a friend sent me an article from some kind of medical website, and it was talking about how, if you like low sex drive might be a symptom of depression. And if you don't feel like having sex, you need to do it anyway. And I was saying, well, there's some nuance to that, but I feel like if you're depressed, you could address being depressed first and not, focus, so much on this symptom of it. And so often in different types of content, there is this kind of bias, like in therapy, the assumption is that there's something wrong. We talked about that in medicine, in so many pop culture, it's the idea, the more sex you have, the more exciting you are. The more sex you have, the more adventure there is. Like what other adventure could there be other than sexual adventures? So I think that keeping an eye out for that, I think that, in queer spaces, we think a lot about homophobia. And I think we're attuned to that and we can see it in the world very clearly. But there, of course, acephobia is not something that people are familiar with. So just being able to hone your lens, and so don't share or talk about things in ways that might be acephobic. Being very specific. If someone tells you they're ace, believe them. Don't be like, I'm sure.
Start there.
Right. Like, don't be like, oh, maybe you need to try more sex. Maybe you're too young. Let people be the boss of themselves and support them. I think a lot of those questions, like, are you sure? You just haven't found the right person. You're not old enough. I get where they're coming from, but they're still annoying. And the ace person's probably been asked them many times before.
I feel like the conversation that you just described was the conversation that tons of queer people have actually had with other people. Mm-hmm. How could you actually know? Are you sure about this? Maybe you just need to meet somebody else. Mm-hmm. And yet we know that sometimes people who have had those unpleasant conversations are actually repeating those conversations with people who are ace. So I think becoming aware of this kind of parallel to the experiences in terms, not in what we experience, but in how we are treated and how easily this bias slips in, I think is really important. But I think as you say that, I could see where people would begin to get stressed out or really struggle with how do I have those conversations without sounding like I am being restrictive about sex. And I think it's probably something people are going to have to invest some time and learn how to do properly.
Yeah. And I think this is one of those things where I think many people, because many parts of our country are anti-sex and our culture is anti-sex. So for many people, their experience was they didn't care about sex. And then they did some work and they realized, they became in touch with their sexuality. It was great for them. So I think oftentimes this comes from, the like, are you sure? Like maybe like I was like this too. That conversation comes from a good place. But again, let someone be the boss of themselves. There's like a fine line to walk between, encouraging people to be open-minded and experiment if they want, and saying, no, I know better than you what you need and what your orientation is.
Yeah, it's sort of that paternalistic approach. So one more question, and just for people who are watching and listening, I've seen a couple of questions pop up in the chat. We're going to get to those in just a moment. So if you have a question, please put it in there, and Liz is going to be bringing those to us in a moment. But Angela, can you recommend any, besides your own book, which is fabulous, but can you recommend any other resources or sites or organizations that you would suggest people look to learn a little bit more after this is over?
Absolutely. So, of course, AVIN, Asexuality Visibility and Education Network, is the main one. But I think there's so many sites beyond that. So, in terms of content, there's books and everything. But there's two podcasts I really like. One is called Sounds Fake But Okay, and one is called A-OK. And they talk not just about asexuality, but also about aromanticism. And I think, so if you're into podcasts, I recommend those. There's a group blog called The Asexual Agenda that I really like. And I think that dipping your toes into the ace world can feel very overwhelming. So I think the asexual agenda is great because it has this high level analysis. And also they can get familiar with the different authors. And, that can help you be kind of a map or an entry point.
Thank you so much. And I'm wondering if, Liz, if you can pop back in, because I saw that we've had a couple of questions, and I was wondering if you can help us identify those.
We have, actually. So I'm scrolling up, and we did have one conversation around, so Laura says, as a bi person, I'm so frustrated by the expectation I'm sexually promiscuous. I feel you when you share as an ace that folks expect Puritanism. It's like the two opposite.
Yeah.
It's sort of set up as two opposite ends of the spectrum, even though, of course, that's not reality.
Yeah. And like I was talking about again before this, I think it's just something that many aces have to fight. I am ace, but that doesn't mean that I want to shame sex. I'm not against you having sex and enjoying it. It's more about having freedom for everyone. But there's such that assumption that if you personally do not partake in something, then maybe you are, you hate everyone or you're judging everyone else who does. And that, of course, links back to the history of, Puritanism in the US and all of that.
Absolutely. We have a lovely question here that gets right to the heart of PFLAG. What advice might you give to a parent who might have already said to a child who came out as ace that they are too young? And how are there ways to heal that misconception or that conversation that didn't go so well the first time?
I think just going back to them and saying and apologizing. I actually think just a parent apologizing to a child is so powerful because that's very rarely done, and saying, I'm sorry I said this. I didn't know as much as I did before, and I think you taking the time to make sure that you read up on asexuality. So again, they don't have to explain it to you. I think your child probably already feels a little bit sensitive and maybe don't want to educate you because what if you're, fighting with them about something and there already has been that breach of trust. So I think making sure you understand the terms, going back to them and, saying, I'm sorry and I'm ready to listen and I've done my work already. Again, before the chat, I was talking a little bit about how I'd received this question from Slate that I'd help answer. And it was a parent talking about how their 11-year-old child said they were ace. And the parent was like, are they too young? How do I know? And what I said to them and what I really believe is that, first of all, people figure themselves out at different ages. So if your child, no matter how young, they says they're ace, affirm them, help them, and also say you can be whatever you want whenever. If you realize you're not ace later, if you realize you're straight or bisexual or gay, that's fine. You can have many possibilities, but support them for what they are right now.
I love that. And it really is, it's what we talk about, PFLAG, meeting people right where they are. And it's okay to say, here is where you are. I love you. I affirm you. And wherever you are along your journey, I'm with you. Here you are. Here I am. Let's keep going. I love that. I'm scrolling up because there was another question that popped up earlier. Here it is from Annette. If you know someone who you think might be asexual, aromantic, how to approach them? And is there an appropriate way to approach them as an ally and someone who wants to show up in appropriate ways?
I think it depends. Do they talk about not asexuality, but they talk about ace issues in a way that suggests they want help? Maybe they're ace and they don't want to talk about it, and that's fine. But what's interesting is that I do think that a lot of people are a little offended if you say to them, maybe you're asexual. And I think that speaks to the stigma. So I actually had this conversation with a friend of mine, and she was saying, oh, I think my friend is asexual and I want to give them your book, but I don't want to offend them. And then what I said was, why don't you just say this book touched on some topics that I think, resonated because of our conversations, not, oh, you're probably ace, read this. And you can say that with any of the resources. I'm not just trying to plug my book, maybe there's an article about asexuality, or, there's actually a documentary called Asexual that used to be on Netflix. So you can say, oh, this was interesting. It reminded me of our conversations. Like, what do you think? Because I think people get to decide for themselves and explore for themselves, not just be told from the outside that you're ace or that you're not ace.
I love that. We have another question here, and we were talking a little bit about this before, but some other identities or terms that might be part of the conversation, and where identities like demi and sapiosexual fit into this whole conversation.
Yeah, so demisexual is definitely part of the ace spectrum. Demisexual, I think, of the ace terms is the one that many people misunderstand, because people are like, they think it means, oh, you prefer to have sex with someone that you have a bond with. And then everyone makes these jokes and they're like, yes, I too think sex is better when you like the other person. But it's not what it is. It's the way I had explained to me was that, you can, like, this person said, I can go into a bar and I just won't find anyone sexually attractive. Like, I can sleep with whoever I want. I can take anyone I want home, but I'm not capable of developing sexual attraction, regardless of my behavior. And I think that explanation of demisexuality makes a lot of sense. Sapiosexuality, I think, is not part of the ace umbrella. I think it's just part of this larger, constellation of different types of attraction and what draws us to each other.
I love that. Leticia, I do appreciate, I have to bring this up just because it made me laugh, that we might need to discuss the link between Alex and poor vision, which got a big laugh in the comments. So there's no way I was not bringing that up, because it brought me a laugh.
There's actually one question that popped up, and Liz, I don't know, because you were working, I don't know if you saw it, but somebody had actually asked if there are any social spaces.
Yes, I did see that. I am going to do that sometime.
Yes, there are. I mean, I think it depends a little bit geographically. So I live in California now. I lived in New York, and of course, in big cities, there's almost always, local ace groups. There are ace groups online. I will say that aces tend to skew young, in large part because young people are more likely to be in the spaces where they're learning about queerness and about asexuality. But there are definitely social spaces. So I think, meetup.com is a place to look for them. And I think that's where a lot of them are hosted. There's asexuality subreddits. So there's a lot of places. And of course, with the pandemic, I'm assuming not that many people are gathering in person, but a lot of ACE discussion really is online and on various platforms. And so I think hopefully you can find something that fits with your schedule and fits with what you're looking for.
Thank you so much. And that was actually the last question that popped up, with only 3 minutes to spare. So well timed.
More than we usually pull off. So Angela, one more question for people who are listening to this and who want to do something. Do you have any suggestions for just their next steps? I mean, I'm going to recommend that they read your book, but is there anything else, like what should your next stop be? Because I think it's really easy to listen to things like this and say, oh my God, that was so fascinating. Mm-hmm. And then you start making dinner and forget about the conversation. Mm-hmm. I would really like to keep this centered in people's minds. Could you give like another couple of actions for people to take if they were really fascinated and moved by this conversation, as I hope that they were?
Yeah, I think one thing that's always helpful is to, support ACE creators of all kinds. There are people who are ACE and are creating films, and they're creating, music. And I think that's something that is just really important. So I think being on the lookout for these kinds of folks, being on the lookout for these creators. And also ACE issues are tied into so many other issues, related to medicalization and related to therapy. So even if it's not directly, helping an ACE person, like if you keep an eye out for causes that may be helpful, I think that is a concrete thing to do.
Yeah. One of the things that we were talking about earlier, and I just kept thinking about, is health classes. Yeah. Do the health classes in your district actually even include a conversation about people who are ACE? Because what would it be like to be that student who has learned about everything except you? Exactly. And many of us know what that feels like.
Or another thing is a lot of census forms don't, or, various survey forms, they include other types of, queer identities. They don't include asexuality. Is there a way to have asexuality also included there? So yeah, that's great.
I think that's a really good point too, because you were talking before about, when there are issues of illness or health and you go to a care provider, they're not going to immediately assume that is a symptom of something dire. That is a point of information they will have about you personally as a baseline, so that if something changes, that would be the concern, not that you are, if that is your baseline.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think so much to do with the health system, making sure doctors and therapists and teachers know about asexuality so that they don't accidentally, say something asphobic.
Yeah, that's going to stick with me. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Angela. This was such a good conversation. I've been peeking over at the chat and people have been talking away. I'm so happy that we were able to have this conversation. Thank you, Angela, for being with us. Thank you, Liz, as usual, for getting the show off the ground and keeping things going. I really hope that we can continue this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks, Liz. Well, everybody, we've run a little bit over time, but it was such a good conversation. So we will do this again next week with another topic. So make sure you check online to see what we're going to be discussing. My mask is behind me, so I can't actually put it on, but I will remind you what we do every week, which is to run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, be kind. And please, please, please keep wearing your masks, socially distancing, and being responsible. And if you can, get vaccinated. We will see you next week. Visit us at pflag.org if you need help. Thank you so much for being with us.